about 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes.
I mean, we're gonna come on and
Yeah, we're going to introduce it. Okay.
right now.
Yeah, come when if you're ready. If you need to get spots.
Yeah, no, I'm ready.
Okay, let's go. Is that full colonel, light colonel?
Light Colonel.
Okay.
I'm an Army chaplain, Army
Okay,
pastor.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, sir. I'm sorry, Pastor.
That's all right.
Of course, you're tuned to AM 1370 WLTH in Gary, Indiana. Latrice Long, John Key. Of course, we got the Colonel in here.
Yes,
You
we're-
want to introduce the Colonel?
Yes, we are really, really pleased to have in the studio with us in person Colonel Antonio Daggett, who's also a pastor, and he is a chaplain, an Army chaplain, and of course, he also was previously associated with Lew Wallace High School, and a leader cadet. He helped to lead the cadet command at Lew Wallace.
And we both went to Lew Wallace.
Yeah, we thank him for his wonderful service there, and of course, he's a family man, father of 10, and
Wow.
just a very, very debonair man, and very obviously
All right.
pays great attention to his duty. And he's here to talk with us about post-traumatic stress disorder, a very significant issue in our
Very
society
real.
today. Of course, we've got veterans that are coming home, returning home, and many who have fought in past wars and still suffer from some of the legacies of that. So
Absolutely.
welcome, Colonel Antonio Daggett. It's a pleasure to have you on the program.
It's a pleasure to be here this morning. Really appreciate the warm welcome, and just looking forward to spending a few minutes with you this
Well,
morning.
great, great. We're fortunate to have you. Now, let's get into it. Let's first talk about how you came to be involved with this issue of supporting veterans.
Well, as a Army chaplain, I spent a lot of time on active duty and reserve duty. And one of my key responsibilities was actually notifying families that a loved one would not be returning.
Oh, wow.
And it was a very difficult task, no question. Found myself, it's a difficult thing to tell a mom that her daughter is never going to come back or her son is never going to return. And I just believe that our obligation must extend much further now as those who are returning are dealing with various issues of post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is really leading into things like suicide and things along those lines. So I'm just so thankful that our Commander-in-Chief, our President, had the foresight to say it's time to bring our men and women home. We could have become so bogged down over there, and yet our President, Obama, recognized the importance of ending that situation quickly and bringing our young men and women safely home.
Yes. Now, you work currently with an organization, Colonel Daggett.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about your position and that organization?
Well, I'm currently the president and CEO of an organization called Veterans Truth. Our email address, for those who are interested, is a kernel of truth, all lowercase, a kernel of truth at yahoo.com.
Now, is that K-E-R-N-E-L?
That's
Colonel?
no, it's a play on words. It's
Okay.
C-O-L, the way
Okay, sure.
Army Colonel is spelled.
Right.
So a kernel of truth.
Right. Wonderful.
And we're just looking to really encourage support of our veterans as they're returning. We're looking for a large return of them as we draw down, and we want our communities, particularly our churches and our social societies, to be ready for the return of these soldiers. They're dealing with so many issues, and it's one thing to say to a soldier, "Thank you for your service," but it's another thing to put some action behind those words.
Absolutely.
Because when I hear someone say thank you for your service and I don't see them put action behind that, then what I really hear is, thank you for doing my dirty work. And that's not what we want to tell our soldiers. We sent them to defend this nation. They've done that admirably, and we must be willing to now support them as they transition back home to their families.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Now, persons that suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, they seem to have these recurring events in their minds. But can you tell us a little bit about what PT, it's also known as PTSD.
Correct.
And post-traumatic stress disorder. Tell us what that is and what are some of the repercussions from people who are stricken with that.
Well,
challenge?
if you could imagine, after you've been in a scary car accident, you play that over in your mind over and over and over. And that happens on a regular basis. You know, someone almost hit you on the street. You play those things over in your mind. So imagine someone who's breaking down a door, engaging in nearly hand-to-hand combat, firing at each other at close range, so much so that their entrails are splattering over each other. I mean, we're talking about some serious, serious impacts on people's lives. And we can't just give this lip service. We must make sure that, number one, the sequestration does not hurt the funding that's so desperately needed to make sure our soldiers and their families have what they need in return, to return. It's not coincidental, or there's no fuzziness about the reality that the level of suicide among our soldiers now is a higher percentage than the civilian population. That's telling us something.
Right.
And we need to respond to that with all hands on deck.
Right. We need to tell our listeners that when you were talking about sequestration, that's a law passed by Congress that is going to make it mandatory for defense cuts and cuts in other areas of government.
Okay.
And some are saying that it's going to jeopardize some of the important programs that are needed. Colonel Daggett, we continue to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder with Colonel and Pastor Antonio Daggett. So, what kind of treatment is available for persons, and what should persons who think they might be, they're veterans maybe who are listening, and they may, what are some of the signs that they should look for to know that they are maybe in need of care?
Well, the first thing we must recognize, and we must be upfront about, is that the VA is overwhelmed.
Okay.
The Veterans Administration is overwhelmed. I don't know if you saw the recent documentary that was run on the overprescribing of medicines there at VA. Many of the soldiers and military people have been overprescribed in medicines, and that concerns us greatly. Yes, our veterans are dealing with issues, but so much of it is spiritual. So much of it, the treatment needs to be holistic. You can't deal with the desire to commit suicide by prescribing a Vicodin pill. There's a hope issue going on there. There's a spiritual issue going on there, and we need to make sure all the chaplains, the churches are involved in dealing with this. But we also need to recognize why this is why it's having such an impact on our young people. Our young people who join the military, by and large, are patriots. They believe in the ideals. They believe that defending this country is so important. So to send our young people over there for the wrong reasons, for weapons of mass destruction that never existed, now for them to justify to themselves their involvement in it, it affects how they see themselves. And so that's an issue of hope. That's an issue of being able to come to grips with what made you feel so good about the nation in the first place. So as a nation, we must come to grips with that reality and deal with that reality and not sugarcoat it. And that's a hard thing.
Right.
I mean, it's a hard thing for a nation to see that, because a nation, a great nation may ask you to sacrifice your life for that nation. But a great nation will never ask you to sacrifice your soul. So we must realize, we must insist that as a nation we come alongside of these young people who've made such a sacrifice and make sure that they receive the support that they need.
Let me ask you this question, Colonel. Especially with those minority soldiers who are coming back and they receive so much rejection when they come back to the community and they've served with honor, and they come back and they cannot get the services that, like a job. Their families have been left alone, and they no longer can get housing and those things. Can you respond to some of the issues that these young people face?
Well, there's no question that any treatment along those lines is highly despicable. But we appreciate the fact that this president and his wife has made military families a priority. And we need to get the Congress in motion behind this. I mean, there's just been too much gridlock in Washington. We've seen it. How do you shut down a government and in effect shut down the VA in the midst of the great need that many soldiers need right now? So we have to come to the reality that either we believe this to be a priority or we're not. My mom used to say, use the pot or get off the pot.
Right.
And at this point, that's what we must insist, that Congress and the functioning process in Washington work well to make a difference for these families. Minority soldiers coming home, there's no question that they're dealing with the added reality of race.
What about the GI Bill? Is that still in effect, or what's happening with that?
The
Because I know a long time ago, soldiers would come home and they could go to school on the GI Bill.
Right.
What's happening with that now?
The Montgomery GI Bill is still available, and it's so important that we encourage our soldiers to seek those opportunities out. One of the biggest problems I find, particularly in our community, is that we don't always have the resources to get the word out to the soldiers that so much is available for them. I said before, VA is inundated, there's no question, they're overwhelmed, but as a community, we must rally around our families and make sure that the word gets out to them.
Where are you located in this city? Where are you located? How can people get in contact with you?
Well, the best way to get in contact with me is through my email, a kernel of truth at yahoo.com. We're in the process of constructing a website that's under construction right now with that same tagline, a kernel of truth. But it's also important that we recognize that organizations that are willing to speak up and speak out are now present and are now making a difference.
Do you have a physical facility right now? Are you working? How are you working at this?
Right now, I'm looking to be working out of one of the churches here in East Chicago.
Okay.
We're looking to rent some space and try to set up a time when we can sit down and counsel some of the soldiers.
Okay.
Obviously, as a chaplain, I've spent a lot of time counseling soldiers on their marriage, on the things that they're going through. But what I do want to point out, I want to quickly point out, this may not even be the biggest issue that's facing our young people right now, particularly in the military. It's facing those that are coming home, but those who are still in the military, the biggest issue that's facing them right now is sexual assault in the military.
That's a big issue.
That is a huge issue. We must face that issue and deal with that issue. 26,000 sexual assaults and 3,000 that actually came to light. To me, that's despicable. As a leader in the military, I'm embarrassed by that. And it's a responsibility that we all must take very seriously. It's one thing to recognize the danger that our soldiers face from the enemy, but our soldiers should not face danger from each other. That is absolutely unacceptable. And in my mind, it calls for a resignation by the Joint Chiefs and the Assistant Joint Chiefs of Staff. Because it's a cultural issue that has to be dealt with, and it's systemic to the military, and the only way you deal with an issue that is culture is that you remove it from that system. And Senator Gillibrands from New York has been heading up hearings about trying to come up with a law that will remove the prosecution of these events from the military chain of command and put it in the civilian chain of command. That's where we need to do it. It needs to be removed. It's clear that it can't be done within the military chain of command, so it must be removed to the civilian prosecution function to make sure that these things are taken care of. When you send your son and daughter off to the military, you need to know that they're at least safe from each other. You know, that has to be dealt with.
Yes,
Tell people that they can call the colonel.
yes, if you have a question for Colonel Antonio Daggett, you can give us a call at 885-1371. I'd also like to return to the PTSD discussion. Suicide, you mentioned suicide is also an alarming issue. What's going on with that, and what do you think is the major cause?
Well, last year we averaged about one suicide a day for military people during the course of last year. So almost, and what the issue is there, I think also is a loss of hope. I think that issues that will lead to a person to feel like they don't have any value or any worth is a loss of hope. So we must again look at this in a holistic way. It's not enough to look to prescribe a pill.
Yes.
We need to deal with the behavior modification counseling that's so important. That's why our chaplains are so important to the military, particularly right now. They must be willing to engage on these issues. I get calls all the time, from soldiers I've known over the years. Chaplain, will you sit down and talk with me? Will you take? Absolutely. I no matter what I'm doing, I take time out to do that, because to me that's critical. What our military has to do is we must recognize we do have this problem with suicide, and we must seek psychological behavior modification to help them.
You have a call on the line. Go ahead, call.
Good morning. Again.
Mm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Right.
Absolutely. And whether intentional or unintentional, um, self-medication many times will lead to overdose. There's no
Yes.
question about that.
Yes.
The issue that many people are not aware of is if that is the case, if that's the case, and it causes death, then your death is by natural causes. Your family's now not, that your family then is not entitled to your pension.
That's right.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's recorded now as a natural cause death. When what stimulated the death in the first place was your struggles
Yes.
from service-connected duty.
Yes.
So that has to be looked at.
Let me say this, he's
And
here.
thank you for your call and
Yeah,
your
thank
comment.
you. Currently, he's here, and he's sitting over there, and of course, coach is not here. But I'm gonna take it upon myself. We have space available. If you wanna work on this space to deal with veterans, we have some very nice offices and computers and everything. I wanna extend it from the WLTH family and from Coach Earl Smith and my brother Mary Williams, because you really touched my heart. We got office space for you, telephones and everything else. So if you wanna take it and understand what you're talking about, because John and I have talked about that spiritual caregiver
Yes.
portion that we have got nationally certified.
Yes.
You know what to do,
Yes.
and John and I, we will be able to help you with that. And I just want to tell you, you got space available if you want.
What a blessing.
Very wonderful, and it will give you, if you have your operation in East Chicago, it gives you a Gary location as well.
It's
So,
private, it's
yeah.
good, and you can do it in confidentiality.
Yeah, very nice of you,
Outstanding.
Tommy. You know, Colonel Daggett, we're talking with, if you just joined us, Colonel Antonio Daggett about very important issue. Always it's important whenever we're talking about our veterans, but
Yes.
we're specifically talking about some of the challenges veterans are facing as waves of them return home
Yes.
now because of the scaling down of the conflict in Afghanistan. That's of course a good thing. We talked about how you mentioned how when you have an auto accident, you kind of relive that event in your mind, or any trauma.
Absolutely.
And so that's what some veterans are dealing with, having dealt with probably some of the most imaginable traumatic experiences anyone, probably those of us who have not served can't really
Right.
imagine, what the intensity of that
Sure.
trauma is. But one of the other, as I was preparing for the interview, one of the things I saw as a symptom was avoidance, and that they essentially broke PTSD down to 3 categories. One was, you talked about reliving, repeated reliving, but avoidance, where there's like a numbness, an emotional numbing. So what's happening as veterans return and they have this emotional withdrawal, what impact does that have on their families?
Huge. It is a huge, and that's an excellent point, because what we've also saw in the statistics now is an increase in suicide among family members of veterans. I mean, it is, the impact is just, it's a wholesale impact.
Exponential.
It's exponential. And the sad part about it is that all of these veterans that are coming back, like myself, are highly trained individuals that could make huge contributions, and that do make huge contributions to our society. At a time when our country needs to create jobs, these veterans can come back and establish businesses that will create jobs in the community, because these are highly technical, highly disciplined, skilled people. And to allow them to fall through the cracks is unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable. But you're right, the reliving of it, the avoidance, there's no question, you'll see this in the family, the unwillingness to talk about things that they've gone through. That's important to note, and it's important to make sure that we engage these veterans and these soldiers and Marines and sailors and seamen, Air Force people. We need to engage them as quickly as possible, because we will have a wave of them coming home very, very quickly.
Colonel Daggett, I want to give you a chance to wrap up, but I want to ask you a question about the fact that you are a chaplain. That means you engage in pastoral duties and
Absolutely.
responsibilities. How does one reconcile war with faith?
Absolutely. Excellent question.
Great question.
The reality is that if you look very closely into the Scripture, into the Word of God, there was, and this is why it's so important that we understand Dr. King's movement.
Okay.
Because it may sound strange to you that a chaplain in the Army would refer to Dr. King. But Dr. King believed in nonviolence.
Yes.
Dr. King was not against force. There's a difference.
That's
And,
right.
and we know this because we remember the incident where Dr. King and others were in a church that was surrounded by the Ku Klux Klan.
Yes.
If you remember that incident, and they were fearful, they couldn't get out. They had them actually surrounded in that church. And it wasn't until President Kennedy sent troops to come and bring them out of that church. Dr. King said himself that day, he says, it's okay to use force for the right reason.
That's right.
And ultimately, we should be committed to defending this nation. We should never be the aggressors. We should never be those who seek a reason for a fight. But we should always be willing to defend the nation. And defense of the nation is totally acceptable in the Word of God. We see that all the time as the children of Israel made their way through the land. God told them that it was okay for them to defend themselves and to protect the promise, the legacy that they had been given. So there's a difference. You know, you can have force without violence, but you can't have violence without force, and that's the difference.
Wonderful.
Okay.
And we've got to have you back, Colonel Daggett. Again, I want to thank Sandy Cogan, Miss Sandy Cogan, for
Yes.
recommending you for an interview. And of course, she does so much good work in the community. I know you've worked with her.
She's great.
Yeah.
Sandy is outstanding.
She is.
Yeah, and we want to encourage you. You know, this thing, as Tommy was saying about supporting our veterans, we got to continue to do that. And so we'd like to maintain contact with you, and we just want to thank you for coming in this morning. Tommy, do we have time for him to just make a final comment?
Yeah, make a phone
Okay,
call.
please, Colonel, make a final
Well, I'm
comment.
so thankful for the opportunity to have come and share with you all. You really do a great work here in the community, and our veterans are really dependent on you all to make a difference for them. So thank you so much for what you do.
Thank you.
Thank
That's
you.
Colonel Antonio Daggett. We'll be right back.
All right.
Oh, thank you.
So
Thank you.
good.
Yeah, he's anointed.
Oh, you
Thank you,
Praise
brother.
the Lord.
God
God
bless you,
brother.
Pastor.
God bless you,
Yeah,
man.
we'd like to, help you out whatever way we can do.
Thank you. That
Yeah,
space would be
You're
very
so good.
helpful.
It was a pleasure to meet
That's
you.
great, Tom.
I know I met you.
Yeah,
Hey,
very
you gotta
good.
see our offices. We got a
Yeah,
beautiful
very
I'd love to
busy.
see
No, you need to see the office.
Yeah,
You really
yeah,
do.
yeah.
Yeah, very
We got a
good.
beautiful place for you.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful.
Beautiful,
And
beautiful.
please, we'll have you back sometime.
Okay.
So if
I'm
you have a
looking forward to
need,
it.
you got something coming up, please let us know.
Okay. All right. Very good. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry I didn't have a tape for you today.
Oh, that's
but
all right. That's all right. We will.
Yeah, it was
I was
worth
able
taking.
to do something with
It was worth taking.